Okay, let's unpack this. Think about living in a world where information just comes at you from everywhere, all the time.
Uh-huh. News, social media, experts.
Yeah, personal experiences too. And they often tell really conflicting stories about what's true, what's right, what's even real.
It can feel like the ground is constantly shifting under our feet. That's a good way to put it.
So how do you find your footing in all that? I mean, how do you even begin to make sense of your place amidst the chaos? Especially when, different worldviews clash and change just feels relentless.
Those are really fundamental questions, aren't they? And questions that feel, well, incredibly relevant today.
Right.
Our sources definitely highlight that. Navigating a world saturated with disparate voices and competing truth claims, it's a defining challenge for us now in the 21st century.
Absolutely. And, that struggle trying to find footing, make sense of a rapidly changing world where maybe traditional certainties are dissolving and all these new influences are flooding in, that was actually central to the life and work of the philosopher we're diving into today, Kitaro Nishida.
Mm-hmm. Kitaro Nishida?
He was a Japanese philosopher, first half of the 20th century, lived through a period of just truly radical transformation in Japan.
A huge synthesis of Eastern and Western influences, Japan's rise as a global power, the upheaval of two world wars. It was an intense time.
Totally.
Yeah.
And his intellectual situation, trying to build this foundational philosophy of place within that shifting context, well, our sources point out how much it mirrors our own experience today, in this globalized, information-soaked world.
That parallel is striking. Yes, Nishida, who lived from 1870 to 1945, he's widely regarded as the first genuinely original Japanese philosopher trained in Western thought.
Okay.
But his genius wasn't just in understanding Western philosophy, and he studied thinkers like Kant and Hegel deeply. It was also in drawing profound insights from Eastern traditions, particularly Buddhism,
Right.
and forging them into something entirely new and unique, something we now know distinctly as Nishida philosophy.
So he wasn't just, translating, not just interpreting the West for Japan or the East for the West.
No, much more than that. He was creating a bridge, maybe? Or maybe it's better to say he was building a new structure entirely, using materials from both shores.
That's a really crucial point. He wasn't just a scholar reviewing ideas. He was a philosopher in the truest sense, grappling with fundamental reality from his own unique standpoint.
Yes, drawing from rigorous intellectual study, but also, as our sources emphasize, from his own deep personal experience. That included Zen practice.
Ah, okay, so that personal dimension is key.
It's integral. His philosophy is said to be deeply rooted in existential awareness and lived experience. He practiced Zazen, sought guidance from Zen masters. He saw philosophical inquiry itself as a kind of meditation or spiritual practice.
Wow, so his attempt to articulate a uniquely Japanese philosophy, it wasn't about creating some closed-off, insular system.
Not at all. It was about finding a philosophical language that could genuinely synthesize these different streams of thought and experience into a coherent worldview, one that could speak to the realities of his time and, maybe surprisingly, to ours too.
Okay, so that's the context. A philosopher deeply rooted in both Eastern wisdom and Western thought, living through profound change, seeking a philosophy of place. Let's jump into the core of his ideas then.
Let's do it.
We'll unpack some key concepts from the sources. Our mission here is to explore how his thinking differs from, and maybe parallels, Western philosophy, find some surprising insights, and hopefully leave you, our listener, with some new questions and maybe frameworks for navigating your own world.
Sounds good. Our journey will take us through some complex, but I think deeply rewarding territory. His concept of Bashō.
Bashō, right. Often translated as place.
Yes, but it's far more than just a physical location. We'll look at the surprising and dynamic role he gives to nothingness.
Nothingness, okay.
The idea of contradictory unity as a fundamental structure of reality. His distinct approach to dialectic, which is really different from Hegel. And the profound relationship he sees between intuition and action.
Lots to cover. Okay, let's start where a lot of Western philosophy starts, or maybe gets stuck. Dualism.
Right, specifically epistemological dualism. This is that persistent philosophical challenge. How does the knowing subject, us, our conscious minds, relate to the object being known, the world out there?
Yeah, the separation.
Western philosophy has often started by positing these as fundamentally separate things.
Yeah.
Think of Descartes, distinct mind and body, or Kant.
Kant. with the thing in itself we can never really know.
Exactly. The distinction between the transcendental subject and the thing in itself, which remains ultimately unknowable because it's outside our framework of understanding. The core issue is, if you start with that separation, how does the mind accurately grasp or know the external object? How do our thoughts actually connect to the world?
It's like we're trapped inside our own heads, looking out through a window and constantly wondering if what we're seeing is the world as it really is, or just, a reflection or distortion from the glass.
That's a vivid way to put it. And Nishida, like many philosophers, found the starting point really problematic. Our sources note his critique of these epistemologies that struggled to define the ground of the given content, the thing that would establish objective knowledge. If the source of reality is seen as transcending the knowing process, the thing in itself just stays a mystery.
So what was his move?
Nishida wanted to find a different starting point, one that didn't begin with this separation. He sought a more primitive, a more fundamental unity, something that holds the subject-object dichotomy in place right from the outset.
Okay, so instead of starting with a split and trying to figure out how to bridge the gap.
Exactly. He looked for a deeper reality, a unity that existed before the split even occurred, guaranteeing the possibility of cognition, rather than making it a problem to solve later.
How did he first try to articulate that?
Well, his early philosophical work, influenced by people like William James and Husserl, used concepts like pure experience and self-mirroring self-awareness.
Self-mirroring self-awareness. Interesting phrase.
Yeah, these were attempts to describe a state of direct, pre-reflective consciousness before the subject-object distinction arises. But he later felt these still kind of implicitly referred back to the psyche, or a form of consciousness that could still be turned into an object.
Right, still potentially part of the dualism.
Sort of, yeah. And this is what led him, apparently, to think about this fundamental unity, not in terms of consciousness, but in, well, spatial terms.
Towards Bashō.
Yes, precisely. In seeking a more concrete, non-psychological foundation, one that could encompass the dynamic process of objectification, how forms appear within a broader context, he was led to conceive of this underlying unity as a field, a container, a place. And that's where his central concept of Bashō emerges.
Bashō. Okay, this feels like the cornerstone. Our sources define it as the concrete situatedness of reality come experience. Can you break that down for us? That's quite a mouthful.
It is dense, but crucial. Bashō isn't a thing. It's not an object, not even consciousness in the usual sense. It's the fundamental field or context wherein reality appears and experience happens. It's a unity that is lived prior to the usual philosophical distinctions we make, like ideal and real, subject and object. Think of it less like a static box and more like the entire dynamic context or environment that makes it possible for anything to exist or be experienced in the first place.
So it's irreducible. You can't point at it.
Exactly. You can't turn it into an object because it's the very condition for pointing and for objects appearing at all.
So it's definitely not just a geographic location, like saying, I am sitting in this room.
Oh, far more profound than that. It's the background, the wherein, that allows the room and you and the act of sitting to appear and have meaning. Nishida actually compared Bashō to Plato's concept of chura.
Chura, from the Timaeus,
Yeah.
right, the receptacle.
Yes, exactly. Plato used chura, often translated as receptacle, space, or even matrix, to describe the place where the eternal forms interact with sensible reality, the medium that receives impressions.
Okay, that sounds kind of like a philosophical place. So how is Nishida's Bashō different from Plato's chura then?
Well, Nishida appreciated the spatial intuition in Plato. But he felt the Greeks, including Plato, didn't fully develop the positivity operative in its formlessness.
Positivity. What does that mean?
It means that for Nishida, Bashō isn't just a passive background or a static receptacle. It's dynamically involved in the very being of the things that appear within it. It actively enables things to be what they are.
Okay, so it's not an empty stage where things just passively appear. The stage itself is somehow actively shaping the play.
That's a good way to think about it. It's a dynamic, active context, not just a container. It also differs from Aristotle's topos, which is more about a defined physical location. Bashō is closer to the ontological sense of chuntra. It's the fundamental context-providing, meaning-giving field that's essential to the whatness and thatness of a thing.
The whatness and thatness.
One of our sources describes Bashō really beautifully as the mirroring mirror transcending all beings as its mirror images.
The mirroring mirror.
Particularly at the level enveloping consciousness. It reflects everything, but you can't make the mirror itself an object of reflection. It's the wherein that is irreducible and unreifiable. You can't turn it into a thing.
The mirroring mirror. That's
Yeah.
a powerful image, almost paradoxical. It lets
Yeah.
everything be seen, but remains unseen itself.
Right. It highlights its ungraspable, non-objective nature. And Nishida saw knowing as involving layers of envelopments or emplacements via the self-mirroring of Bashō.
Layers of envelopment,
Right.
like nested context.
Kind of. Think of it like this. You understand a single word, right? But its full meaning really emerges when it's placed in a sentence.
Okay.
The sentence provides a Bashō for the word. Then the sentence itself is understood within the Bashō of a paragraph, which is understood within the Bashō of a chapter, and so on. All the way up to the Bashō of your entire life experience, or maybe the whole universe.
Ah, I see. Each level is encompassed by a broader, more fundamental Bashō.
Exactly. Our understanding deepens as we grasp the wider context, the larger places things inhabit.
I like that analogy. The word's meaning isn't fixed in isolation. It's determined by the larger place it's in. And this seems really relevant to our starting point navigating conflicting information.
How so?
Well, if we see information not just as isolated facts, but as facts embedded within different narratives or perspectives or cultural context, different Bashōs, maybe we can understand why they conflict and find a way to relate them without just saying one is right and one is wrong.
Absolutely. Seeing information as existing within different Bashōs is key. And for Nishida, the most fundamental Bashō, the ultimate context, well, that's the Bashō of true nothingness.
Okay, nothingness. Now, in Western philosophy, and honestly in everyday language, nothing usually just means absence, right? The lack of something. If I say there's nothing in the fridge, it means no food. How is Nishida's concept of nothing different?
Profoundly different. For Nishida, mu is not mere absence or non-being as simply the opposite of being. It's a central, dynamic, and even generative concept.
Generative. Okay.
He distinguishes between two kinds of nothingness, oppositional nothing and absolute nothing.
Oppositional nothing. That sounds a bit closer to our usual idea.
It does. Oppositional nothing, Taritsu mu, is relative nothing. It's the negation of a specific being. If something is not red, that negation only makes sense in relation to the specific quality red.
Right. It's defined by what it's not.
Exactly. It's a nothingness that exists within or in opposition to the realm of being. Our consciousness, for instance, can be seen as a form of oppositional nothing in relation to the objects it perceives. It has to, in a sense, empty itself to reflect the object, as one source puts it. It's the not X, where X is some specific thing.
Okay, so that's the kind of nothing we're familiar with. It's relative. What about absolute nothing, then?
Right, this is where it gets really deep. Absolute nothing, Setaimu, is true nothing. It's the ultimate, undelimited Bashō that transcends and encompasses both being and oppositional nothing.
It encompasses both.
Yes. It's described as the contradictory identity of opposites. Now, this doesn't mean being is non-being in some simple logical confusion. It means it's the fundamental ground where being and non-being aren't just opposed, but are fundamentally codependent, mutually negating, existing in this dynamic, inseparable tension.
Wow. So it's not just the absence of things, it's the fundamental field from which both existence and specific non-existence emerge, like the potentiality for both.
Yes, something like that. It cannot be objectified. You can't think about it as a thing. You can't describe it as simply being or simply non-being. Any attempt to grasp it conceptually immediately reduces it to either a mere being or a mere oppositional nothing.
It slips away.
It does. It is, as one source notes, an ontological, prior to or beyond our usual categories of being. It slips away from being made a subject of judgment because it's the very place or predicate enabling any judgment to occur in the first place.
An ontological. That's a challenging idea. It's the background that you just can't bring into the foreground.
Exactly. Absolute nothing is the concrete ground, the sort of abyssal depth of Bashō, from which the fundamental intuition of contradictory unity, that inseparable tension of being and nothing, affirmation and negation, actually occurs. It provides the necessary openness, the space for things to be, to appear, to differentiate themselves. Without this absolute nothing as the encompassing field, the relative distinctions, the oppositions, the specific beings of the world couldn't appear or interact.
It's really counterintuitive, isn't it? But for Nishida, nothingness isn't just a lack. It's dynamic, essential, even generative.
Yes, a fertile void, not an empty one.
Okay. And this concept you mentioned, contradictory identity, where opposites are fundamentally linked, That seems really central.
It is. Contradiction is a pervasive motif throughout Nishida's philosophy, and it's crucial to understand it goes beyond just logic.
Right.
Yes, logically, in the Bashō of absolute nothing, even logical contradictories like being and nothing are held together in unity.
But how? In standard logic, a contradiction like A and not A just can't exist simultaneously. It's an error signal.
In classical logic, yes. But Nishida is speaking from the standpoint of the encompassing Bashō, the background universal that holds the terms of the contradiction.
Can you give an example?
Our sources use the example of red and not red. Logically, these are contradictories. Something can't be red and not red at the same time in the same respect.
Right.
However, both red and not red belong to the universal color. From the standpoint of the Bashō of color, both are held together as possibilities or determinations within that larger field. Their opposition occurs within the encompassing unity of color. This is what he calls contradictory unity, Bujinteki Jujitsu.
Okay, I think I'm getting it.
Yeah.
The contradiction isn't eliminated or resolved into some higher thing that cancels them both out.
Yeah.
It's held together in tension within the background or context that makes their opposition possible in the first place.
Exactly. It's not red is not red, but red and not red exist in dynamic relation within the field of color. And this applies to fundamental pairs. Being and nothing, affirmation and negation, I and not I, individual and universal. This unity of contradiction where the formed and the forming, the determined particular and the determining universal, transcendent and immanent, are dynamically inseparable. This is the necessary premise for cognition and reality itself, according to Nishida. It exists before any separation.
So contradiction isn't a flaw in reality for him. It's actually a fundamental structure of it. And you said there's an existential dimension to this, too.
Deeply so. Nishida connects it to lived experience and Buddhist ideas like shumetsu, generation and extinction, the constant arising and passing away that constitutes existence. Life itself is seen as fundamentally self-contradictory.
How so?
Well, one source quotes him saying something like, without negating oneself, one cannot negate what negates the self.
That's a challenging idea, that overcoming opposition requires a kind of self-negation.
It suggests that our very ability to confront challenges, to learn, to grow, involves a process where we have to move beyond our current limited self. It's not about destroying the self, but a dynamic overcoming, maybe.
Okay.
And this inherent contradiction is also how we experience and understand the world. Nishida observes, there is no eye without the seeing of things, and there is no ear without the hearing of sounds.
Right.
Now, this doesn't mean things are just creations of our perception. Instead, it points to the dialectical relationship. The act of seeing requires objects to be seen, and the existence of objects is revealed through the act of seeing. They exist in a contradictory unity.
The I exists by seeing things, and things exist by being seen, in a sense.
Yes, in the broader sense of appearing within Bashō. We see and hear things through this dynamic, self-contradictory dialectical engagement.
So my act of seeing isn't just passively receiving light from, say, a tree. It's an active process involving my own structure, my history, engaged in this dynamic interplay with the tree. And it's through this interplay, this kind of self-contradiction, where my structure is determined by the tree while I'm also structuring my seeing of it, that I actually apprehend the tree.
Precisely. The relationship is dialectical and involves this fundamental tension. And this extends to knowledge itself, like judgment. A judgment like the apple is red involves the grammatical subject, the individual apple, becoming a predicate and being placed within a universal category.
Redness. Right. The individual is grasped by being made universal.
Yes, and this reflects a deep self-contradiction of historical life, where the individual exists in this dynamic tension with the universal society, categories, history, and so on.
This is so different from the Western philosophical tendency to try and resolve contradictions or view them as logical errors. For Nishida, contradiction is foundational. That must lead to a very different understanding of dialectic itself.
It absolutely does. While Nishida was deeply influenced by Hegel, especially Hegel's concept of the concrete universal and his dialectical method.
Thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Right, often summarized that way, where opposites are resolved into a higher unity or concept, known as upheavals or sublation. Nishida's later absolute dialectic fundamentally diverges from this.
Okay, how does his dialectic differ from Hegel's sublation?
In Hegel, the dialectical process often moves towards a resolution, a synthesis that preserves elements of the thesis and antithesis, but transcends their opposition into a higher conceptual unity.
Right.
Nishida's dialectic, in contrast, is a dialectic of place and nothing. It's rooted in that radical interrelationality and non-substantiality of reality we talked about, grounded in the Bashō of absolute nothing.
So it's not about concepts resolving into a higher concept, but about the dynamic interplay and tension within that fundamental field of reality.
Yes. Opposites like universal and individual, or the act of making something poiesis and the thing made, or determination and freedom, they remain in dynamic tension. They exist in what he calls a chiasma, or inverse correspondence of mutual self-negation.
Mutual self-negation, like the individual and the universe.
Exactly. The universal determines the individual, but the individual, to be truly individual, must negate that determination to be self-determining. And in doing so, they in turn determine the universal. They don't resolve into some higher concept. They exist in this perpetual dynamic interplay.
And that lack of resolution is important.
Crucial for Nishida. It prevents any final objectification of reality or the individual. It preserves freedom, in a sense.
It sounds less like climbing a ladder of concepts toward some ultimate synthesis and more like being part of a constantly moving, interconnected dance where opposing forces define and enable each other.
That's a really helpful image, I think. His dialectic is characterized as concrete and irrational.
Irrational, not irrational.
No, not irrational, but rooted in historical life. Rekishitiki Seme, the dynamic, lived socio-historical reality rather than being purely an abstract, rational process, which is how he viewed Hegel's idealism.
So for Nishida, logic isn't some abstract system we impose on reality. It's something that emerges from the dynamism of life itself.
Precisely. He saw true logic not as abstract thought, but as the science of concrete thought, and true dialectic as the path by which reality explains itself. He explicitly states that in his absolute dialectic, life mediates logic, not the other way around.
Life mediates logic.
That's a key departure. It grounds his philosophical system firmly in the lived, active, historical world.
This brings us really nicely to his concept of acting intuition. If logic is mediated by life and contradiction is fundamental, how do we actually know or understand the world?
Right, this is where his philosophy becomes very practical, in a way, though still profound. For Nishida, intuition, choken, isn't what we often think of in the West.
Like a passive receiving of sense data, or a sudden gut feeling.
Yeah, or even a purely intellectual flash of insight.
Mm-hmm.
For Nishida, it's deeply, dialectically intertwined with action.
So knowing the world isn't just seeing it or thinking about it, it's also fundamentally about doing in it.
Yes. The core idea is this radical unity. Seeing is acting, and acting is seeing.
Wow.
It's a dynamic relationship where you see things through acting in the world, by engaging with your surroundings, by doing.
That feels very different from the traditional Western view where action often follows knowledge. So first you understand something, then you act based on that understanding. Nishida seems to be saying they're simultaneous, or maybe even that action precedes a certain kind of understanding.
Exactly. Acting intuition involves the active structuring of what we see, rendering it into forms. And this isn't just happening in the mind, like Kant's categories organizing sensory input. It's happening physically through our bodily engagement as we shape and are shaped by our environment.
Can you give a concrete example? The sources mention one, right?
Yes, the primary example given is driving a car. When you're driving, you don't simply perceive the road, the traffic signals, other cars, pedestrians, as just static, separate objects.
Right, you wouldn't last long if you did.
Exactly. Your seeing of these elements is integrated with and determined by the very act of driving. You see the distance to the car in front, the speed of oncoming traffic, the space for a lane change, not as abstract calculations, but through an immediate pre-reflective bodily grasp that's inseparable from the action of steering, accelerating, braking.
Right, your body is engaged, your senses are tuned to the demands of the task, and your understanding of the environment is your skilled navigation within it. You're not just observing the driving situation, you're actively participating in and structuring your perception of it through the act of driving.
Precisely. This is what he calls a bodily seeing, inseparable from the action. In this pre-reflective immediacy of acting intuition, the usual dualisms, inner-outer, mind-matter, subject-object, they haven't really separated yet. It's a dialectical intuition, where we are simultaneously determined by the environment, the road, other drivers, and actively working on it, steering, adjusting speed, shaping the situation through our actions.
So a fundamental way we know the world isn't through detached analysis, but through skilled, active engagement with it. Seeing is a form of doing, and doing is a form of seeing. That really gives a whole new meaning to learning by doing.
It profoundly shifts the idea of what knowledge is, doesn't it? It suggests that our deepest mode of knowing isn't abstract contemplation, but active, embodied participation.
Where does this acting intuition come from?
Nishida says it arises from what he calls the understanding, which for him exceeds mere intellectual thought. It belongs to the world that infinitely expresses itself. The world as we experience it through active intuition is fundamentally a world of expression and understanding. Even nature, he says, is seen and understood not as some purely external mechanical system, but on the basis of this active intuition as a world expressing itself.
This is foundational then to his later focus on the historical world. How does that connect?
Yes, his later thought increasingly focused on the historical world, Rekishiteki Sekai, as the ultimate concrete reality. He understood this as the world of interacting persons and their creations, culture, society, technology.
Yep.
He saw our individual self-determinations, our actions, our choices as simultaneously being self-determinations of the whole world. The universal whole determines itself through the actions and interactions of its individual elements, which are us.
So that individual universal dialectic we discussed earlier, the one based on contradiction, now plays out on the big stage of human society and history.
Exactly. The universal is now often equated with society, history, culture, the whole socio-historical context. The individual is undeniably shaped and determined by this universal, by language, customs, history.
Right, we inherit all that.
But to be a true individual, they must also be self-determining, acting freely. And in being self-determining, the individual in turn determines and shapes the universal, transforming society and history through their actions. It's this radical, ongoing dialectical process.
Environment makes man, and man makes environment. That quote from the source really captures that reciprocal causality, doesn't it? That dynamic interplay.
It perfectly captures it. That reciprocal creativity is the very dynamism of historical life. He drew parallels from biology. The organism and its environment mutually shape each other, but he extended it to the uniquely human socio-historical realm. We are conditioned by our environment and history, yes, but as intentional acting beings, we constantly work to transform and recreate that environment.
This perspective makes human existence fundamentally historical and creative, constantly in motion. What about time in this framework? Is it just like a linear sequence of moments?
Not at all. Just as Bashō is the non-objective place of reality, Nishida conceived of time not as a static container or a simple linear progression. He thought in terms of place-time or Ortszeit.
Place-time.
The present is the foundation of concrete reality, analogous to the place of nothing in temporal terms. The present isn't some static point between past and future. It's profoundly dynamic and self-contradictory. It lives by dying, as one source puts it. It's a continuity that exists only through constant discontinuity.
Wow. So the present is the dynamic spot where the tension between past and future, between what's already made and the act of making, between being determined and determining the future, all exists in contradictory identity.
Yes. The substance of time, for Nishida, is non-substantiality, absolute nothing. The undelimited present, like the place of nothing, can envelop past, present, and future as its own self-differentiations. It's the sort of bottomless ground of temporality, not a fixed point on a line.
And this understanding of historical life and place-time is deeply linked to human activities, specifically production.
It is. The source discusses production, poiesis, not just as, making widgets, but as ontologically constitutive for a human being, meaning we don't just exist and then make objects or create culture. We exist in the making, in the creating. Our being is fundamentally a becoming through our productive engagement with the world. Modes of production, therefore, aren't just economic systems. They are concepts of radical historicity, of being as active becoming in place-time. The world of acting things, the historical world, is the affirmation of negation in this dialectical process of creating reality, by overcoming the not yet.
So human existence, history, time, production, the world. It's all woven together through this dynamic, contradictory, dialectical understanding of place and nothingness, centered around the acting individual. This is a massive integrated system he's building.
It truly is. It attempts to grasp reality as this dynamic, self-determining field where tensions and contradictions are actually the source of life and creativity, not problems to be eliminated or smoothed over.
It definitely feels like a philosophy that pushes beyond purely rational or intellectual understanding into something more fundamental, more lived. And speaking of deeper dimensions, the sources also really highlight the significance of religion in Nishida's philosophy.
Yes, absolutely. For Nishida, the religious realm provides a crucial key to understanding the concrete basis of the real. This perspective is woven through his work really from his earliest writings on pure experience right through to his final essays on the logic of the place of nothing and this idea of the world of worlds.
What did he mean by the religious basis? Was he advocating for a specific faith, like Buddhism or Christianity?
Not in the sense of promoting a particular doctrine or institution. For Nishida, it's more about what he called religious self-awareness.
Yeah, what's that?
It's the existential awareness of one's own fundamental self-contradiction, experienced right in the deepest core of one's being. It's an encounter with one's own limits, one's own nothingness, described as an experience of life and death. It's a profound, often unsettling, existential insight into the contingent and contradictory nature of the self.
And he saw this kind of self-awareness reflected in both Eastern and Western traditions.
Absolutely. He found powerful expressions of this existential insight across different traditions. In Buddhism, for example, he saw it in Dogen Zen's emphasis on forgetting oneself and dropping off body and mind through practice. And also in true Pure Land Buddhism with its concept of other power, Jinanhuni, where liberation comes not through heroic self-effort, but through the working of the Buddha's vow.
So finding true self-identity through self-negation.
Exactly. An existential striving that is lived, not just conceptualized or resolved neatly.
When in Christianity, where did he see parallels there?
He found striking ones. He referenced the Apostle Paul's statements like, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me."
Right, Galatians.
Yes. Or, "As in Adam all die, so in Christ all shall be made alive." He saw in Martin Luther's view of faith as God's working within the believer, and in thinkers like Pascal, a similar dynamic of dying to the egocentric self and encountering the divine through this act of self-negation and surrender.
So it's less about choosing one tradition over the other and more about finding this common existential encounter with the absolute through a process of kind of self-emptying.
Precisely. And to articulate the nature of this absolute, this ultimate reality encountered through religious self-awareness, he drew upon Buddhist logic, specifically the Sokuhi logic. From Mahayana Buddhism, especially the Prajnaparamita Sutras, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. This logic is often summarized in these paradoxical formulations like form is emptiness and emptiness is form, or more generally, A is A, therefore A is not A, and precisely because A is not A is A.
Okay, my mind is definitely bending again. A is A, therefore A is not A. How does that even work? Can you give an example?
Let's try a simple, non-religious one first. Think about a wave in the ocean.
Okay, a wave.
The wave is a wave. A is air. Simple enough, but therefore the wave is not the ocean as a distinct entity separate from it. A is not A.
Right, it's distinct.
And precisely because the wave is not the ocean as a distinct entity acknowledging its particularity, it is the ocean. In its fundamental nature, it's made of water. It's part of the ocean's movement. So precisely because A is not A, they is A.
Okay, that helps a bit. It highlights the simultaneous particularity and relationality and maybe underlying identity.
Exactly. It captures the idea that something is fully itself only in its relation to and distinction from, and yet fundamental identity with something else or its ground.
So how does Nishida apply this Sokuhi logic to the absolute, to God?
He used it to describe God or the absolute not as some static, purely transcendent substance, but as containing self-negation within itself. The absolute is absolutely being because it is absolutely nothing, and absolute rest because it is an absolute movement, one source quotes him saying.
Wow, that's a truly dialectical absolute.
It is. It definitely resonates with Western mystical ideas like Nicholas of Cusa's coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites, or maybe Kierkegaard's absolute paradox. But Nishida develops it through his own lens of Bashō and absolute nothing. The absolute, in its very nature, empties itself.
Kenosis.
Yes, he uses that concept from Christian theology, but within his framework, the absolute inverts itself into the relative, and it maintains itself in the plurality of individuals and the dynamic world.
So the absolute isn't just some distant, perfect entity completely separate. It's intimately involved in the world, and its involvement is through its own self-emptying or self-negation.
Yes, and this leads to his concept of inverse correspondence, particularly between God, or the absolute, and man, or the finite self.
Inverse correspondence.
They encounter each other not by bridging some gap between fixed entities, but through mutual self-negation. The absolute empties itself into the world and individuals, and man finds his true self not by asserting the ego, but by dying to the ego, encountering his own nothingness. Faith, enlightenment, salvation, these are understood as this process of mutual self-negation, finding true identity in the field of the absolute nothing.
This really challenges traditional Western ideas of a purely transcendent, unchanging God, completely separate from creation, doesn't it?
It does. And while he saw these deep parallels in Christian thought, Nishida later felt, this was in essays written during World War II around 1944, that the Buddha, as described by Sokuhi logic and the concept of emptiness, sunyata, perhaps better encapsulated this absolute dialectic
How so?
as an absolute that envelops the world and the individual in contradictory self-identity. He felt this was maybe clearer than a Christian God sometimes conceived as merely in opposition to the individual. But, he consistently sought to bridge and find resonances across these traditions.
So, his exploration of the religious realm provides the ultimate existential ground for his philosophical ideas of nothingness, contradiction, and dialectic. It's not just abstract logic. It's tied to the deepest human experience of self and reality.
Exactly.
And incredibly, he extended these profound ideas even further, applying his philosophy of place to the really complex arena of world politics and globalization.
Yes, this is one of the most striking applications of his philosophy. It seems surprising at first, right? A philosopher of ultimate reality engaging with international relations.
Yeah, it seems like a leap.
But our sources note that, particularly in his later years, amidst the very restrictive political environment in Japan leading up to and during WWII, Nishida used his philosophical language as a way to subtly express a vision that differed from the prevailing nationalism and imperialist ideology.
Really?
He found a way to articulate dissent and propose an alternative vision philosophically using these core concepts.
So how did his idea of Bashō, contradictory unity, and the dialectic of the world apply to global relations?
Well, he envisioned intercultural encounter and the global world not as a simple clash, or as one culture dominating or negating another, not an us versus them or East versus West scenario.
Okay.
Instead, he saw it as an opportunity to discover a deeper and broader ground through mutual difference and co-relativity. Cultures, nations, civilizations, they don't have to assimilate or erase their unique identities to interact. They develop vis-a-vis one another in dynamic relation within a larger global context, or Bashō.
So it's not about homogenization or domination, but about distinct identities interacting in a way that respects and is even enabled by their differences. That sounds radical.
It is, especially for his time. He proposed the concept of a global world as a multi-worlded or world of worlds intercivilizational culture.
A world of worlds.
In this vision, each nation or culture maintains its own identity, preserving their own respective standpoints while developing and uniting with others through mutual mediation. The interaction isn't about one absorbing the other, but about each mediating the other, leading perhaps to a higher unity that doesn't eliminate the distinct parts. The goal is a true world culture formed by this ongoing reciprocal process.
A world culture that isn't based on a single dominant national or cultural force, but on the relational development of multiple distinct cultures.
Exactly. His vision explicitly precludes a single center of power or a single dominating national force. It's about cultures developing relationally, dynamically, in the encompassing medium of the world of worlds.
That seems incredibly relevant today.
Doesn't it?
In our interconnected but often deeply polarized world where conflicting ideologies and cultural perspectives clash constantly. Thinking about how distinct identities can relate without one dominating the other seems like one of the most urgent philosophical and practical challenges we face.
It feels highly relevant. Nishida's ideas of contradictory unity, mutual mediation, and retaining distinct identity while relating to others. They offer a philosophical lens for navigating these contemporary tensions. How can we find common ground, that deeper and broader ground, not by demanding conformity or erasing differences, but by engaging with them dialectically, seeing the universal in the particular and the particular in the universal, maybe?
Wow. This has been a really deep dive into some incredibly rich, complex, and I have to say, pretty mind-bending ideas.
Nishida doesn't make it easy.
No. We've traveled from the problem of dualism to his concept of Bashō as the non-objective place of reality, the dynamic power of absolute nothingness, the fundamental nature of contradictory unity.
His distinct dialectic of tension rather than sublation.
Right, the integration of seeing and acting intuition.
And how he applied these ideas to the self, time, history, the depths of religious experience, and even his vision for a multi-worlded global culture.
Nishida's philosophy, precisely because it embraces contradiction and dynamic tension, it really resists easy categorization, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It's neither purely Eastern nor Western, neither simply Buddhist nor Hegelian. It's a unique synthesis, reflecting the very contradictory unity and ongoing becoming that he described. As our sources note, his work remains incomplete and open, resisting a final, closed system.
Which perhaps is its greatest strength. It feels like a philosophy that's still alive, still wrestling with the fundamental tensions of existence that we continue to face.
I think so.
So here's a final thought maybe for you, our listener, to ponder as you navigate your own reality. If, as Nishida suggests, reality itself is a dynamic field of contradictory unity, where being arises from nothing and seeing is inseparable from acting,
Mm.
how does understanding this change the way you experience your own place in the world and your interactions with things and other people?
Mm.
When you encounter conflicting information or opposing viewpoints or maybe tensions within yourself, how might embracing contradiction, seeing those tensions not as errors to be eliminated, but as fundamental aspects of reality and life itself, how might that open up new ways of understanding and acting authentically?
Look for those tensions and connections in your own experience. They might just be where the deepest insights lie.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the philosophy of Kitaro Nishida. We hope it gives you some new ways to think about the world and your place within it.